Let's get started. Hi everyone, thanks for being here. Today I wanted to talk about CI/CD pipeline or just treating Akamai as code. I think there have been quite a few talks around similar topic. The whole purpose here for us was to get you to a point where you can sort of envision this as an architecture rather than something that someone, like others are just using it or trying to implement it with Jenkins or some kind of a framework. So before getting started about me, so the presentation was actually put together by two of us. It's me and Duncan, and we're both part of a team called Global Consulting Services. We work on web performance consulting and building custom solutions. So over time, we got a lot of questions around APIs and PAPI and CLI and what do we do, how do we automate? And what we thought was, okay, let's take a step back. Instead of being very tactical in terms of how do I just get the job done, let's try to come up with some kind of an architecture and the things that really are required for you to get there. So let's start with the basics. Why do you need a CDN? You need it for caching. That's like the bread and butter. For things that you can't cache, you need to accelerate. And then you need to do some kind of a content targeting. Like you don't have rights to serve in a certain geo, you block that user. Or you have a lot of security requirements, bare minimum. You just come on to a CDN and then you only have like ports 40 and 80 and 443 open. You are protected against a lot of attacks, and the best defense against a distributed attack is a distributed defense, and that's what a CDN gives you. But if you look at it from the team that works on this is more around the abilities, the scalability, reliability, availability kind of a thing. So it's more geared towards the ops. That's how most of the CDNs started out with. But what happened is, like, over time, this is not the only thing that CDNs did, right? Like, you work with Akamai and then you do a lot of things. You could be doing things like multivariate testing. You can use the edge server setup for splitting your user traffic based on some criteria. It could be because of cookies, devices, regions, the kind of paths they're accessing and so on. And once you do that, you could be routing them to a different data center, different paths, or translating it to a different paths that your origin can understand and so on. If you think about it, what you're actually doing is like you're releasing it more and more like a feature. And when you have something similar, like a thing that you're trying to target, maybe it's not impacting the whole page because you don't want to give out your caching because that's the bread and butter. So maybe you're stitching it on the edge because you want to take advantage of that along with everything else. All of this is looking more like something that a developer would require from a CDN. But does it mean that it's only the dev and the ops who talk to us? Not even that, because we are starting to see, like, once you have the dev and ops, you always have the QA people talking to us because they need to test. So we need to expose some kind of a header, some kind of a feature where they can verify and they can validate if a certain thing worked in the right way, right? And then you have a lot of security products with not just Akamai. Like most of the deck I've written in such a way that it's like CDN agnostic. So even with any other CDN, there are a lot of security offerings. You may be tweaking the WAF rules, the IP ACLs, and so on. And you may have the sales teams, like if they want to have some kind of a URL-friendly URL. Thanksgiving is coming up. We need a microsite for Black Friday. Here's a bunch of 3,000 URLs. Translate it in a way that your origin can understand. You don't want to do that. You offload it to the CDN. So you have a whole gamut of users trying to talk to a CDN. And invariably what happens is you end up with something like this. You have like a single point contact or some kind of a ticketing mechanism. And the moment you have ticketing mechanism, then you start getting into the same issue of you not being able to release code on the CDN at the same velocity at which you make code changes on your end, right? But that's not what you want. You don't want the CDN to be your choke point. You want the CDN to be agile, like the velocity and changes that you push out should be the same as your code base. It needs to be integrated as closely with your dev environment. It should not, like the first time you see a CDN should not be in your dev domain. It probably should be in your dev dot domain, right? Otherwise it's way too late in the testing lifecycle. Of course, you also need fast failback. Like if you are pushing out something, you need to know what happened and you need to fail fast if things did not work out. But if you actually look at it, I'm talking about pushing things fast, testing it early, failing, getting a feedback quickly and failing fast. If I had not put the word CDN, it would have looked like I'm just describing your regular code lifecycle, right? So why is a CDN different? It actually shouldn't be. It should just be a part of your pipeline. And if you want to consider a CDN to be a part of your CI/CD pipeline, these are some of the things at a bare minimum you need. You need to have ability to get your API credentials done. If you're building out a HTTPS website, you need to have some kind of an API to just get those certificates deployed. And from an operational perspective, all the core stuff, push out a new config, rollback changes, issue a purge, these things should be possible. And most important for a developer, they should be able to have like a self-provisioning environment. They should not open a ticket and wait for someone to pick up. Maybe in a week they get an environment and then they start testing. That shouldn't occur. And finally, testing. And I think like if you have been attending sessions, this has been a recurring theme. Testing is getting more and more important when you go through into an automation mode. And with a CDN, there are some things which are different, as in you need to check things like TTLs. You need to check if a specific CDN feature kicked in, for which you need help from the CDN. There are some which are like behaviors. You implement a redirect, you need to check if you actually got back a redirect. Now this is a behavior, but it's not a change on the web page, it's more a change on the status code. And then you have the actual content that changes, like A/B testing, where the page content itself changed. In this case, there is no difference whether there is CDN or not. Your test case just works, right? So what we did was like we were thinking through this, and then like you would have seen this diagram like 1,000 times in the last 2 days. But to me, the places which were a bit more important was in the coding aspect and in the testing aspect. The coding aspect because we actually have something that works. In the testing aspect, I'm not convinced. There's the ESI test server that solves a specific problem. There is Impulse for performance testing, but we don't really have a very good mechanism for actually aiding you in your testing. So I have some ideas. There are some things that engineering is working on, but we'll see. But what we have learned since like last few months, years is we need to have APIs for everything. Like every new product that we release is going to have API. So we have now moved to an API driven development. For everything that existed, we will be building and launching out APIs. But of all the APIs to begin with, this is the one that is a lot of interest, because apart from everything else, it offers you two things. One is you can do everything that you would do on a property manager using the API, but even more important, it allows you to pull back the code as a JSON object. And once you have that rules in your hand and you put it in your version control, all of a sudden the way you move your code changes. Like you're not reliant on the property manager now, you're moving the code in the same way as you would move through your code pipeline, right? And of course there's a CLI. To me, this is pretty helpful because like I think in one of the earlier talks, Dilip was mentioning you would spend effort building out your code base to support these APIs. PAPI, for example, if you had to search a config, you had to manually look through all the things that you have in your account, then keep matching, find a host name, that is your config, pull a rule. PAPI got upgraded, there is a single API call. The CLI got upgraded, it's available. Your code, you would have had to change. So that's the biggest benefit you get out of the CLI, right? Anything that changes, you just auto upgrade. That's one. And the other thing is like, whenever we build new API, and you can start plugging in a CLI for that through this interface. Like first we had the purge, then came the property manager, then I think 2 weeks back we released the visitor prioritization cloudlet CLI. So it keeps getting added. So it's just a wrapper, but generally pretty helpful. So these are the building blocks that that were available. And the idea we had was, with whatever exists out there, if I am a customer and I had to build it, what would my model look like, right? So what we did was like, we were trying to put it all together, and then we came up with something like this. So we can use the CLI and Akamai Open, and then we used just public tools, GitHub for our version control, Jenkins for orchestration, simply because it's free and we knew how to use it. A few Python scripts, because both of us knew writing code in Python, and we ended up with a pipeline. And at a very high level, the model, what we had, looked something like this. So let me start from here. You have a developer. The developer can directly access using the property manager interface, which is how you would normally do it. But what we wanted to do was like, let's not go there. Let's try a more agile or a DevOps friendly approach. So they have a dashboard, typically your Jenkins pipeline view, which gives you like an overall status on what is happening. And then the developer gets to see a service catalog, like what is it that user can do? Can they push out config? Can they create a new config? Can they edit a config, and so on? And they issue the command, and that goes to the task orchestration engine, which is Jenkins in our case, which in turn calls the CLI, which in calls PAPI if it is a config related stuff, or it just calls purge if it just wants to throw things out of the cache, right? And then there is a test framework which actually tests these changes. And of course, there's the release engineer who looks at the version control, like after some of the changes are done and there is a pull request, approves it, and then things go to production, right? This is a very high level logical model we had. Just explains the same thing. But what we wanted to do was like somehow go back to the roots of DevOps, which is everything should be in your version control, and your version control should be the source of truth and not property manager. So we wanted to get there. So what we did was like, yeah, this is nothing new. It's just how you would introduce a feature. So your developer takes a feature which triggers in the pipeline static code analysis. We are just doing a JSON lint, and then deploys it as an ephemeral configuration. Then it runs some tests. It runs two types of tests actually. One is what we call as infrastructure check, which is your origin accessible? Is the edge host name even resolvable? Once you have that, you can run your functional tests. And then it sort of branches. If the tests were successful, it decommissions that environment because it's ephemeral. We don't need it. And then it also issues a pull request. Now, at that point, it's a circuit breaker. We want a human user, at least we thought that is how it will look like. A human user to go in and say like, the change is good, let's promote it to prod. So how did we do it? So what we did was we used the concept of a gold config or a master config. And the way I think it probably makes more sense is that config is an IDE for your developers. So the config actually doesn't serve traffic for any real domain. You can put some dummy domain just to avoid errors on the property manager. And the way it works is you go to that config, you introduce a change, and if you put a specific comment, in our case, if you put CI_ready as a comment, our Jenkins is polling it. At this point, there is no webhook from PM to any outside service. So we have to poll. The moment it detects that there is a new version and there is a comment, CI ready, it pulls that, creates a new branch. So the core thing is like your master branch has to be safe. You cannot make that read at any point in time. So create a new branch. That's your feature branch. Push it out as a new QA or ephemeral config. Run the test. If it is successful, issue the pull request, right? And then it just continues for prod deployment, right? So this is just a different view of the same thing. Like how the responsibilities sort of split. The reason was in the old model, everything was Akamai. Like everything is property manager interface. You don't really have much of a control except for testing. But here, what we wanted to highlight is there is very little that Akamai actually has control on at this point. Like a lot of things is happening in the orchestration phase. It's yes, you are going up and down, but it's not always on Akamai, right? And then we, just for coolness sake, we said like, okay, once the deployment is done, also send a message to Slack. So if you're monitoring on a Slack bot, you get a message saying something was deployed. The most important thing was, again, on testing. So what we did was we said, okay, we need to have some kind of test. We just built a framework around Python-unittest. And then what I've shown there is like you can parameterize it, and then each line there is a separate test case. It actually executes as a unit test, even though it's not a unit test technically. But the only reason I did it that way was any test that fails causes the pipeline to break. And that's a good thing for me because I can go back and debug. And if the pipeline breaks, it also doesn't decommission my ephemeral environment. So I can troubleshoot both the environment as well as what broke. And when you're testing with Akamai, there is a slight change that you may have to do, as in I've been talking to other customers, and what I heard is this. Typically, there's Selenium, which is used for functional testing because you can use a headless browser, which is fine, but you go through like different steps, transactions. The main problem with Selenium is it doesn't give you HTTP status codes, it doesn't give you headers. So if you want to go down this mode of automation, you need to have some kind of a plugin or a different test cases which just does this part of the testing, which is Akamai related. This is something you may have to keep in mind if you go down the route of full automation. So I just wanted to show you the pipeline. I think it's not way too interesting as such. Like it just looks like this. So what I can do here is let me sorry. So what I wanted to do was like show you just how the pipeline gets started. So by the way, this is just a shortcut that we took for the sake of the demo, and the end goal I feel is like we should not be using this interface. The changes should actually be introduced as JSON through your version control. And there was a good talk by Spotify where they showed like you can use a VCL file, a varnish description language, and then mix it with YAML, so the varnish acts as a template and the YAML acts as the parameters. You merge it, you get the JSON. But yeah, I mean, in this case, we were like, okay, let's simply get this started. So say I just do some simple thing. I don't want this very header rule, stop it. And then I go here and then I say CI underscore ready, and then I save it. Okay. Let me just come here. I can't even see it. You know what, let me just start the pipeline. I can't see it from here at all. So I just started that. Yeah, so it's started. It'll take time. It'll take about 20 minutes. So one of the things that we built this whole pipeline was to show that it can be done for us and for our customers. But at the same time, one of the main objectives for us was to find all the gaps. Where are the things that break? What are the issues that our customers will face if they go through this? So I'll walk you through some of the things that we had seen as we were building this. The first thing was like we had a very hard time trying to understand how we will move the source of truth from property manager to the version control, because one of the biggest challenges is like how do you support parallel development, because at this point that is painful, because on property manager you can have theoretically 3 versions. One which is being edited, one which is live on staging, one which is live on prod, and that constrains you a lot. With this model, what we did was like, because the config that is being used as a master, that just acts as a template. So every time you want a new code change, you just use that, and then you pull the rule back as a JSON. And then when you activate it, that is the time you are sort of instantiating that template. So that is your environment. So none of the environments are like long driven. They just go away after this test is done, right? So that's one way we could work around this challenge of having parallel development. And the idea was, if you can do that, then what happens is every time there's a new developer who wants to introduce a new change, you just go through this process. The pipeline kicks in multiple times. There are multiple branches. The next step is very easy because it's the same problem you have with your code. How do you merge different branches? So you just merge them based on your test output, right? So that is one challenge we had. The next thing was in terms of testing. And we went back to engineering, and then I think they're still looking into it. I was in a few sessions where a lot of customers gave the feedback as well, which is not every feature that we have is available as a header. And not every header actually matches with what is being tested. Let me explain. If you try to check the TTL, you have a value in the cache key which shows the TTL, but it need not always be the real TTL, because the way the rules are written and what happens, there are a lot of dependencies. So what you see is not what you get. So that is another issue. We don't have an answer for it at this point, but there is different products that they are working out to give you real-time logs, which will address the issue. If you try to work with the troubleshooting API, which gives you the log, it still doesn't give you this information. So there are some features that are very hard to test. That is the feedback we gave to engineering. And the next thing was it's slow. It takes about 15 minutes for a new domain to be activated on staging. It takes about 20 minutes for the edge host name to be created. So if you have an ephemeral environment where you're creating a new edge host name and a new a new domain and an edge host name, it takes about 20 minutes. And I'm reusing a CP code here. If I were to create a new CP code, it straight away takes an hour. So we were like, we don't really need any of that. What happened? Anyway, I'm done with the presentation, but I can just go through. Let me just complete the thought process. So one of the things that engineering is working on, and I think they have spoken to a few of you, is the concept of a DevOps network. What they want to do is, it's literally like one ghost for one edge server for a developer. So when you say that you have a dev config, you can deploy to that single machine. So it's like you open a SSL tunnel from your machine to Akamai and back. So when you make a request on your browser, it goes to that single machine, which applies that code that you have on that developer machine, then comes back and uses the developer machine as the origin, and then returns. So you can have like a server running and the browser running, and then it goes through Akamai and comes back. That's the idea. Now, because it's like a single machine, single instance kind of a thing, it doesn't go through any of the other validation checks that typically exist. So you can push out a dev domain, or I mean, you can actually test it as dev.dev because it's one machine, doesn't matter, right? So it takes away all the confusion of having a CP code, trying to purge, having to create new edge host name, all of that issues are gone. That's the biggest thing that we are trying to get addressed at this point in time. So those are stuff I had. Let me talk to the AV guy, and once he's back, I can get the deck on. Yeah, sorry.
So I'll get back to my first question, but now that you mentioned about the dev, where can I find out more about that concept? Is it a name? Are there people who?
Sure. It's called DevOps network. DevPop, POP. DevPop network, point of presence, and Sid Fatkar is the product manager. I think people are around in the dev zone. They'll be able to give you more information on that.
Okay, and then my question is on the problem of having to create a new host name and CP code every time. Do you consider just have a rotating, like just pre-populate and just rotate them through?
That was the other idea as well. Like if you know for sure that, yeah, you can keep on rotating and that's faster. There's no real reason to create multiple CP codes. There's like, for a developer machine, there's no real reason to even create different certificates each time. So it saves a lot of time when you can do that, yes. Yeah. Sure.
One of my questions you already asked by yourself. UI control configuration versus the version control configuration. I think it's same as any other configuration we do in our work. But you had actually like extra complications because within the UI you have different versions, right?
Yes.
Active version, production active version, same also inactive but changed version. So
right.
Which version as a best practice do you think like we should put it in the repository and what we maintain?
So the question was, when we are working with this model, which is the version that you pull? Is it the active version on prod, on stage, or the inactive version? So if you, well, there is no active version. The way I showed it was that config is a template. So when you start working with PAPI, I forgot to mention this. So when you work with PAPI and you pull the rules, right, it works slightly different from the way the XML works or the property manager interface works. So on the interface, everything is one big XML, right? But when you pull from PAPI, there is one call that will only give you the rules. There is one call which only gives you the hostname and edge hostname mapping. So all of a sudden now you have, like if you were to build the configuration using variables, your config now starts acting as a template, right? And it's based on the variables, it actually starts to get instantiated. Like if you want to use the object-oriented term. So now what has happened is if you have this template config and you use that, like you just pull the rules, and the rules are the part that you put in your version control. You don't care about the host name because that's anyway dummy. Then using this version, so there is no concept of activating at all, right? So using this templatized version is what you create your config. So using CLI or PAPI, you say like push these rules. While pushing the rules, add this host name, and that is my origin, right? That is what gets activated.
Everybody uses the repository as the changeover that should be practiced. There are fixed.
Yes.
Having just the same case.
Yes, so that is a big problem. Yes, so the question was, this model works as long as everyone sticks to this process of using the template config with the version control. What if somebody just goes and directly starts making change on the UI? Unfortunately, there is no way to control that. This is the workaround for now. So I guess it's a control you have to put in as a process rather than something that is automated. Right? Yes. Yes. Sure. Yes. So the question is, most of the developers are working behind a proxy, so their machines can't be used as the origins. So how do we address that? Let me not go to the product. There's an open source thing called ngrok, NGROK. It has a free model and a paid model. So if you go, it opens a tunnel. Now, I tried it and my security team shut it down, saying that violates the policies. So that's one option. The other correct option is like you have to use a product like, if you want to do it at a very large scale, you have to use something like EAA that we have here, which can act as a VPN-less tunnel, and then you can open it up. The third option is what I was talking as the DevOps network. So what we are trying to do is, EA is a full-blown product, and it has a lot of bells and whistles, which is for people actually logging in and doing stuff. We don't want all of that. All we care about is just opening this tunnel and ensuring that it is as per the corporate policies. So we are trying to see if we can extract only that part of the code base, put it in the DevOps code, and then get it working. But it's still under discussion, so I don't know how it will turn out. But that is where we are trying to get to.
My understanding is that DevOps actually
Yeah, it's still under discussion. So they're still trying to figure out if we need everything that is there. Yeah.
So now more and more we are talking about getting the JSON rules on that managed as code
Right.
repository. So in a common world, if you had all your code in your repository, you want to manage it. So if from a developer's point of view, that's I can put that into like an IDE or something like that, and then I can debug, I can do whatever to that.
Right.
Is there a concept where if I start managing Akamai in a similar way, and based on property manager documentation, I know exactly what tags I need to put in the property or
Right.
JSON?
Right.
Is Akamai thinking of any kind of IDE or some kind of debugging tools
Right.
to help developers there?
Right. So the question is Akamai thinking in terms of any developer support for working with the JSON? I have two things to say. The first thing, we gave the same feedback. If I'm a developer, I'm not going to learn the JSON. It's way too complex. So we are trying to do some things. So the first thing is, with the CLI, if you have seen, or if you had worked on the feature toggle lab, what we have done is anything that's there in the default section for the properties, you can start working out, changing values for that using just CLI command. You don't even have to look at the JSON. Same way with the CLI, you can change the origin host name, you can change the shared object path, a bunch of things. So some things we have now exposed it through just the CLI. For anything that is beyond that, there is no real answer, as in like I've not heard anything. But what we are also trying to do is there's this idea that's floating around. It's called the edge worker. I don't know if you have spoken to the developer teams. So we are trying to address that through that as well. Like you can write Akamai rules as JavaScript code, which gets translated into rules whatever we need it as. So you work with a much more developer-friendly JavaScript code base, and that is what gets converted as rules. It's still an idea. We are working through, like, we're trying to understand if that will support all the use cases or if you're missing something. So if you have any feedback, please let me, or there are product managers out there, let them know, and then we'll take it as feedback. Thank you. Sure. The product manager is Sid Fatkar. He's on this floor. He's in a meeting right now. In case he's not around, you can just give me the feedback and I can pass it along. If you can't find me, there is like here there is Davey, Shafiq, Kirsten, Hunter, or yeah, I mean anyone who's here on the developer zone, you can give them the feedback and it'll go up to the product manager. Sorry? Sid Fatkar? It's P-H-A.
Oh, P-H?
Yeah.
P-H-A?
P-H-A-D-K-A-R. Yeah. Yeah, welcome. Cool. Thank you.